Thank you. So this is a duet. Fadi sets expectations. I'm going to try to lower the expectations so that I like that picture with the rocks. I feel like I'm the one that's different here, if you can figure out. I'm going to talk about events that were 48 years ago. How many people were born 48 years ago? Oh, there is some. All right. A brief introduction. My name is Steve Crocker. I'm currently chairman of the board of ICANN. Once upon a time, I actually did productive work, I think. Knew how to program and so forth. I was, by accidents of time and place, part of the team that put the first node on the ARPANET and helped develop the protocols. And I want to talk about just one little part of that experience that might or might not be relevant here. I've actually spent a fair amount of time on security matters at various times. I spent time as a program manager in the early 1970s at DARPA and ran one of the early white hat type, we didn't have the term then, but white hat type penetration teams looking for holes in the operating systems of systems that were on the ARPANET at the time, and learned the hard way that even people that we had hired who were working for national laboratories, had security clearances, and were allegedly adults, nonetheless took it upon themselves after they discovered the holes to decide that if those holes weren't fixed to their satisfaction, that they got to exploit them and make a big deal about it. And so we learned the hard way that some discipline was necessary. Lessons that I think you've all seen one way or the other. Over time, I've been involved in various aspects of network security in the last several years, helping try to deploy DNS sec security extension for DNS. And my preference has always been on the defensive side, and not only on the defensive side in terms of catching attackers, but even more strongly, how to build secure systems. I've known Gadi for several years and was intrigued by the idea of this conference, so I decided to drop in and see if I could see what's happening currently. So I'll take you back to the earliest days on the ARPANET and just describe something briefly. I grabbed a couple of slides out of another talk. I won't burden you with the whole talk, and definitely not give you the whole history of the ARPANET, of the internet. The original ARPANET was 4 nodes as a seedling for what became a larger thing to connect diverse computers. And the critical aspect of this, here's what the router looked like. This was a refrigerator-sized computer. Cost about $100,000 by the time it was all put together. On $1969, that would be like $500,000 today. You can buy much more capability, obviously, off the shelf for a few bucks. And the speed of this network was trivial by comparison with today's networks. And so I want to talk about the standards process. When the network was put together, there was a very, very peculiar strategy employed. The base level of buying the high-speed lines, so-called high-speed lines from AT&T, and building those routers was done through a formal contracting process, specifications, money spent on contracts, and so forth. The upper layers of that process, what are we going to do with this network? What do the protocols look like? The word protocol, I don't even think was extant at the time. What are we going to do with this was not defined and was left to, in a kind of field of dreams way, to the people who were going to use the network. Well, who was going to use the network? Well, this thing was imposed, given as a gift, if you will, or imposed, if you like the other way of looking at it, on research sites that were already receiving funding from DARPA. So, and UCLA and a bunch of us, the other places were the recipients of this. And so, in a sort of organic way, we got together and said, okay, we understand the basics. Some packets are going to flow back and forth. What are we going to do with this? And we sat around a table in meetings much, much smaller than this, in meetings that fit sort of like around here, half a dozen people or a dozen people, and started to freewheel, have just general discussion of, well, obviously we want to log into each other's machines, we want to move files back and forth, but there must be more interesting and sophisticated things to do, so let's not just stop there. And at the same time, we also know that we're not going to know everything, so we wanted to leave everything as open as possible. So we had an open set of discussions for several months, from roughly August 68 through March of 69. And then after some discussions intermittently as we visited each other's laboratories, we said, you know, we better start writing some of this down. And that seemed like a very simple, straightforward thing. Each of us took an assignment of topics that we had been talking about. And I casually volunteered to, in addition to writing up a technical aspect, I said, I'll try to organize these notes. Over the next couple of weeks, I found myself losing sleep and feeling very, having a high degree of trepidation, because every time I started to jot down the simplest ideas about what these notes would look like, excuse me, I found myself being extremely worried. What was I worried about? Well, we were in our 20s. We were graduate students predominantly. Nobody had given us formal authority. And we, thank you, that's very helpful. And my concern was that somebody would take whatever we wrote and say, who the hell are you? Who gave you the authority? And since we were in the west coast of the US primarily, I figured somebody would come out of the east. I didn't know whether it would be Washington or Boston, but I figured it would be somebody important and sort of take us to task. So I said, so after a few failed attempts at trying to, you know, sit at a desk and do something, one night late, I said, I've got to get something done. And jotted down what seemed to be the simplest of all possible things, which I said, these notes don't have any meaning whatsoever. Write down anything you want. They could be questions without answers. They could be a design without an implementation. They could be, et cetera, et cetera. And the only thing you need to do is put your name and a date and an institution and a title on it. And we'll number these, and I'll give you the number as soon as you write it. You have to write it before I give you the number. I didn't want a lot of holes in this series. And I figured it was a temporary hack that would last for a couple of months. This was 6 months before the first node was going to be installed on the network, and I figured after a few months there'd be formal documentation, a manual, and a binder of some sort coming from somewhere, I didn't know where, and that these notes would die out. And to emphasize the point that these were low status, unassertive kind of things, I got this brilliant idea. I said, we will mark every one of these, no matter what it is, a request for comments. And I thought it was just a little quirk. To my great surprise, the idea persisted and didn't die off, and the requests for comments have lived on indefinitely. When we had to organize the first 100 of these and write an index to it, I was a bit surprised. When I was invited to write the part of the introduction to RFC 1000, I was greatly surprised and kept thinking about the Sorcerer's Apprentice. You can't turn this thing off. And if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, the term RFC is credited to me. That is not what I set out to do in life. Not by a long shot. So what Gotti, I think, wanted to accomplish by having me come back is share the germ of an idea that may or may not be applicable in this environment in terms of how to get organized. I'm not here to sell you that you should take that template and that it works for sure. I'm only here to tell you that we did it, and not only did we do it, but I think we also understand some of the things that made it successful and some of the things that might not be applicable. For example, in that environment, we had a very low degree of competition. All the money was coming from one source. We were not in a commercial environment. There was a great pressure to be helpful and share. There was very little reputation, and essentially no money was riding on it. Not necessarily the same as today. We were not in a product situation. So you have to evaluate what matches. What I can tell you is that, so here's covers what I said, and we were dealing also in a very open environment in every respect. Open technically, open architecture, and open participation. Anybody could come, anybody could participate, no limitation on the distribution of the information, no limit on use of that information. We weren't charging anybody anything. It made a huge difference. If you compare the standards process that emerged and evolved into today's IETF versus the telephone companies' systems that were of an earlier era through the ITU and so forth, you find that you're not allowed to participate unless you're a government. You're not allowed to get any documentation unless you pay a lot of money, et cetera, et cetera. Completely different sort of environment. We had what we call the Network Working Group. This is what evolved over multiple cycles into today's IETF. Anybody can participate, no barrier to entry, and very, very helpful, not only that there was no barrier to entry, but it served as an enormous educational process. And so there's a fair amount of new people that come into it all the time. The RFCs, as you all know, are wide open, and they're strongly oriented to things that work as opposed to, here's the idea, let's all agree on the ideas, never mind if we've ever tested it, and then you go force people to implement it, and then you discover that there is a hell of a lot of trouble in that process. So that's the end of the slides. I tried very hard to conform to the time limits here. And I guess feeding into the discussion perhaps for this afternoon are the natural questions of, does it make sense to foster some sort of sharing of ideas and to do so in a way that promotes other people building on that? And what are the hazards of doing that? How much information sharing of the defensive kind or of the constructive kind is going to be considered either proprietary or disclosed too much to the bad guys. And with that, have I discharged what you had in mind? Super. Yep.
So Steve, with the highest level of respect, the approach that you have has led to a whole bunch of problems. So if we apply this, Einstein says you can't use the same thinking to approach problems, it's not really exactly equivalent, but you can't use the same thinking to approach a problem that you created, right? And then again, the highest level of respect, if we look at this approach as leading to the problems that we had, should we consider a different approach?
I like the question a lot. The question is the approach that was taken led to a lot of problems. Yeah, the approach that we took led to a lot of problems. So therefore, and I'm going to stop with the therefore because I want to back up. So the implication is that that was wrong, but perhaps you can look at it was, look at all the stuff we created, including the problems. Isn't that a great success? But not tongue-in-cheek, let me suggest this. I can tell you that when I watched the protocol development process, I had in mind, this is me personally, that this would be a great opportunity to bring formal methods into the picture, to think very hard about the corner cases, to document them, to use strong tools if possible. And it became clear very quickly that that wasn't the way things were going to go. There was too much pressure to get things built. There was not enough shared understanding of the potential problems that were going to come. And things evolved as you have seen. So, oh shit. This is my co-chair on the board of ICANN, and we'll have a little fun. Maybe. Where is he? Hey, Shireen, you're live in front of an audience here in Austin, Texas at a network security conference. Hi. I'll talk to you later.
That's a joke.
Aha.
Right, so I think that's kind of fundamentally part of the question. Did we do something wrong?
Yeah. So that's a very astute question. Should we revisit Postel's law? What is Postel's law? Jon Postel was sort of curated and nurtured the whole RFC process after I stepped out of it after a couple of years, and was right in the middle of all of the architectural work. And what he said was, and he was focused on, you got disparate systems that are trying to communicate, different people implementing what are allegedly the same specifications, and there's always a little bit of ambiguity. And so you got a message or a bunch of messages sent from A to B. A thinks that they're sending the right message, B doesn't think that it's the right format, and these things don't fit precisely. And so he said, be liberal, be conservative in what you send, be liberal in what you accept. And a typical easy case is the spec may be ambiguous as to whether the word has to be in uppercase or lowercase or whatever. And on the receiving side, try not to care. And on the sending side, try to be narrow and consistent about what you do. That would be the typical kind of thing. And your point, which I've thought about actually before and so forth, is in security, it's exactly backwards. You want to be very tight about what you accept and not very liberal. And then, and so that's a different orientation to things. I think that's as far as I want to go with that.
Well, you mentioned earlier that, you wanted to originally apply formal methods and a whole bunch of pressures, trying to get the product out the door, et cetera, et cetera. All that still exists today.
Yep.
The other point you just mentioned about specs, one of the problems that we've encountered over time is, where instead of a shall, you said should, and it leads to little wrinkles in a lot of the protocols, and then great fun ensues.
I hate it. Yeah, I'm not too upset about that. What I will say is something entirely different that what you were asking about exactly, but which reminded me, is there's way too much complexity in everything. And one of the things that I think is absolutely necessary is simplicity through abstraction. Divide things up into layers, divide things up into abstractions about the major things that you're trying to accomplish, and there is not enough of that kind of thinking. There's too much detail, do this, in the specification level, in the implementation level, and everything. And there's no way to analyze that, no way to get a holistic picture of everything. And our tools are wrong. Here's an exercise that I thought of some time ago. Walk into any enterprise, point to a router, dump out the access control rules in that router, and ask the person responsible for the router to explain each and every one of those rules. Not a good day. The number of rules buried in a normal router is enormous, and the history of those is lost, and there's no tools around. At least this was, a decade or so ago when I thought about this. I don't know what the current state of affairs is, but it's really ugly. Way too many leaves, never mind the trees, and you can't see the forest at all. I think it's time I get off the stage here. One more.
Do you have a favorite RFC, and if so, why?
Do I have a favorite RFC? What an interesting question. I have two. Postel started a tradition of an April Fool's RFC, and I managed to actually get one through the system. It was before IPv6 was designed, but during the period when we were worried about it. And ATM was a live current thing. And I wrote an RFC suggesting that the new headers ought to be, I forget the precise number, but it was over 1,000 bits. It was a multiple of 53 and a bunch of other things. And that with the size of header, there was no need for a data payload. So the address was the message, and there was no security requirement. So that's the silly one. Along an entirely different line, but relevant to this community, a couple of us realized that trying to implement crypto techniques in software posed a fundamental problem of where do you get the uncertainty, not the pseudo-randomness, but the true randomness out of software. It's actually contrary to the whole idea of repeatable digital designs. So people do half-assed things. They'll open up the microphone, or they'll look at mouse movements or keystrokes or disk movements or whatever, And if you write the code that does that and then distribute it across a large number of machines, you find bad things happen, like running on a diskless machine doesn't do anything if you're looking at disk activity, or I can go on and on. If a microphone doesn't exist, you get all zeros or whatever. So we wrote an RFC. The number I remember is 1750, but it's been replaced to a higher order number, but you can find it that way, that speaks to software strategies and combining multiple strategies so that you get a high degree of randomness. A year after we wrote it, Wells Fargo had a problem where they sort of failed, or Netscape actually had the problem. And it caused Wells Fargo to shut down for several weeks, and our stock, I was at Cybercash at the time, went up 50% briefly, very briefly, before it plummeted down to zero. But anyway, the bridging the gap between the theory and what happens if you have all of the formal structure of hardware and NSA behind you and so forth versus practical things, I thought was a significant contribution. Don Eastlake and Jeff Schiller did much more work on it than I did, but I felt particularly pleased with that, in answer to your question. Yep.
Thank you, Steve. So